Hi everyone, we're extremely happy to host here two of the three co-authors of the paper. I will briefly introduce them and then we'll begin. So we have here Professor Mohammed Wattad, who is the president of Ramat Gan Academic College, former dean of the School of Law at Tzfat Academic College, and many other credentials. And Dr. Tal Mimran, who is a faculty member at Tzfat Academic College, lecturer of international law at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and also many other things. The third co-author, Dr. Zaid Falach, judge of the Haifa District Court, couldn't be here today, and they will present their paper who addresses some thoughts on the nexus between organized crimes and terrorism.
Well, thank you for having us here. We are very delighted. Actually, you forgot to mention the most important affiliation. I'm a research fellow at the center. That's very important. But I would like, first of all, I apologize on behalf of Judge Zaid Falach for not being able to be with us. He wanted to be with us, but because there are some legal regulations where he needs to receive consent by the Minister of Justice, and given the political atmosphere, all applications not even denied. They are denied substantively. No one addresses them. So he asked me to apologize on his behalf. In my part of that discussion, I would like to share with you how come that we have started to deal with this topic and why so. Because mistakenly, many believe that it is related to the rising numbers of criminal activity in the Arab society, and that is why we have addressed this topic. This is of course true, but this is half of the truth. Originally, I spoke about that way before, back in 2007. And what happened in back 2007 is that I was very young, and I allowed myself to do things that otherwise I wouldn't have allowed myself nowadays to do them. My assumption used to be that there is clear distinction between criminal organizations and terrorist organizations. And at that time, I was writing a paper to a journal in Oxford about terrorism, and it crossed my mind to address the topic of, even in a nutshell, on the difference between criminal organization and terrorist organization. So I met Professor Sharif Bassiouni in Italy, and I guess you know Sharif Bassiouni. He is the one on international criminal law, and I asked him the question. He made some kind of introduction between me and some people in Italy, and it happened that by the end of the day, I met someone who is supposed to be head of a criminal organization in Sicily, in Siracusa. And as I said, I was very naive, which means I was also very courageous, and I asked the question, what is the difference between you as head of a criminal organization and a leader of a terrorist organization? So he smiled at me and responded quite surprisingly that I made two mistakes. Now, just, expressing this statement that I made two mistakes by somebody who's supposed to be dangerous made me shaky, really. And I said, I apologize. What mistakes did I make? He said, the first mistake, you called me head of a criminal organization, but you should have called me leader of a criminal organization. I said, fair enough. So what difference is between you and a leader of a terrorist organization? He said, the second mistake is that you should not have asked about the difference, but about the common grounds. And I said, yes. He said the following. People fear us. People are scared from us. And fear is the tool that we use in order to gain power. I allow myself to do what a lay person does not allow himself to do. I have the courage to break the law. You, as a normative person, you don't have the courage to. break the law. So I said, so how does that play with the issue of terrorism? Said, basically, people focus on terrorism within the limits of the new understanding of terrorism, namely related to politics and the urge to change political status of government, etc., etc. But the whole concept is about fear. He said that, and he stopped speaking, and then I started really thinking about that. So it took me time to develop a theory about that because I needed to do serious study. While I was studying terrorism, I did not really study criminal organizations. And then one day I met Dr. Tal Mimran and Judge Zaid Falah, and we were talking about something else at all. But then it crossed my mind that Zaid Falah wrote about accomplices, about the legal status of a head of accomplices. In this context, the criminal organization, and Tal deal with international law, international criminal law, and of course with terrorism and technology. And I do criminal law and work on terrorism. So I invited them to start writing about the topic. My study on terrorism led me to focus on this sense of fear. And I figured something which is very interesting. Luckily, we have laptops, and when we want to look for something, we do Control F. So I'm in big love with holy books, although I'm not a religious person. I find some anecdotes there. And I decided to look for the word terror in the Bible. And I found the word terror again and again and again. So I was wondering what would be the word in Hebrew. I opened the Bible in Hebrew, and I found the word chitat. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the Bible, they know that there are certain degrees, several degrees of fear expressed in the Bible, and chitat is the highest degree of fear. And it is described in all instances as that fear of God, like Cain fearing God, and the Spirit of God is floating all over his head, and he doesn't know where the punishment is coming from. If we focus on the question of fear, we understand that when we talk about terrorism and when we talk about criminal activity, it is the same degree of fear. Just take simple examples, and it happened to me. You don't have to do the same confession, but I'm ready to make the confession. You know, when you drive sometimes and somebody just cut you illegally, and then you horn there immediately. But I horned for the wrong people. It was a BMW, white one with black windows, and then I saw the traffic lights coming, and it was red, so I was wishing, please. I was praying all of a sudden become a very religious. Change, and it's not changing. And then I was stuck there. They opened the windows and said, looked at me like that. Was clear, foreign people with black suits and black caps. So I said, my apologies. Had I known this is you, I would have just, opened the road for you. They didn't like it, but I had my daughter with me, so I have to be very careful. And they left me. But all the way to Haifa, where I live, I was looking behind my back to make sure that no one is really following me. This kind of fear basically affects to me all the way to Haifa, just thinking that something might happen. When we think about criminal law, the classic dogmatic thinking of criminal law is that it relies on individual responsibility. But already in the previous century, we had learned that it is possible to have criminal law as joint criminal activity, and that's why we developed the so-called exception, but no one really calls it nowadays exception, because it has become part of the heart of criminal law, the law of accomplices. And we created exceptional rules in order to bind this kind of activity within the limits of a criminal law. At certain time, we have learned that we should have also a special set of rules for criminal organizations. Take, for instance, in Israel. back in the 2003, we legislated a statute that deals with struggling against criminal organizations, creating the so-called status crimes. Namely, the fact that you have a membership card, there's nothing like literally, but it needs to be proved. Membership card as part of a criminal organization, all the more so if you are the head of criminal organization. Leader, my apologies. I have to get familiar with the term. I'm not get used to it. That's in itself a crime. And that in itself puts on your shoulders a certain burden concerning your responsibilities as well towards the law. Quasi speaking, the same understanding, without calling it so, applies to terrorism. We have the Patriotic Act in Israel, the law on fighting terrorism. Yes. And the legislation there and the regulations, in many instances, come together. And that's for good reason. Now, because we live in Israel, and because of the small sentiments and the sensitivity towards terrorism, as it's always terrorism against the country, it is hard for us to use the term terrorism to other issues. In the recent years, I think this is kind of self-evident already. Every single Arab citizen in the state of Israel, when you ask him or her about what's going on in terms of criminal activity, they say we live under a state of criminal terrorism. The fact that they say that should challenge us as scholars, as legal scholars, to start thinking otherwise and consider why are they saying that. To the same extent, in September, on the 9th of September, on the 11th of September, when the first airplane crashed into the Twin Towers, no one really knew that this was an act of terrorism. So there was panic and there was fear. But once bin Laden showed up on TV and he, took responsibility over the terrorist attacks, the kind of fear became different. It was the terminology has become different. A nation at war. Like we the collective. Now, if you inquire into the activity of organized criminalizations, you should learn that it is not that they are killing just each other or fighting against each other or targeting particular people. They target sometimes innocent people in order to achieve their goals. Exactly as the case in terrorism. Take another example. What is the difference between an individual criminal and the terrorist when they enter the courtroom? In most cases, individual criminals cover their faces, even though they have not been, found guilty. But they feel some kind of shame being at this situation. Whereas people who are accused of being terrorists, they enter the courtroom with charisma and pride, and even they show you the V sign. Have you noticed that every time leaders of criminal organizations enter the courtroom, first they enter the courtroom with lots of relaxation, as if this was their home. Second, they lead the discussion. They create, exactly as leaders of terrorist groups, create chaos in the room. They are not just another player in the courtroom. And of course, they don't cover their faces. Their argument is that they are victims of the system. They can be liars, but still, this is their truth. The way at least they say it. Exactly as terrorists do the same thing. Now, you might really want to focus on the incentive for terrorism and keep telling me that it's about politics. By the way, historically speaking, terrorism, as used to be known, not always focused on politics. Sometimes it was about a religious one or territorial one. So the incentive, the motive changed from time to time. Nowadays, we speak about it because of basically not only limited, but because of the 11th of September. By the end of the day, the result is the same result. And by the end of the day, we make one big mistake when we talk about terrorism, because we treat terrorism to be a crime in itself. Although terrorism is not a crime. Terrorism is the commission of the regular crimes of which we are familiar: rape, assault, killing, etc., etc., etc. The difference between terrorist crimes and regular crimes is the danger associated to the action, the level of the danger. People who commit terrorist crimes, people who are very motivated and they're willing to reach the result whatsoever. And that is why we treat them to the utmost degree of dangerousness, and therefore the focus on terrorism, on the proof of this factor, should come into play at the second stage, the second phase of the criminal trial, that is the stage of punishment, within the proportions of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt. Organized criminals do the same thing. Now, I am willing, and with that point I will finish and leave it for my friend to continue. I'm willing to take the political incentive seriously, assuming that this is truly the incentive. Do you know that all terrorist organizations, not only they have interactions with organized crimes, with criminal organizations, but also sometimes they exert their terrorist activities through criminal organizations. When you speak about Hezbollah, Hezbollah is one of the very prominent terrorist organizations nowadays. First of all, they have established themselves, willfully speaking, through criminal organizations that deal with drug. Hamas in the West Bank. The leaders, the headquarters of Hamas, are the ideologistic people. But when they want to exercise their ideology and take it out to the stage, they do it many times through organized criminalizations in the Gaza Strip. Now, many times, this nexus is not clear to all players. They have proxies in between, so that no one can track them. And this is crucial. So if we want really to fight terrorism, and if we want really successfully to fight criminal organization, we cannot deny this nexus. All the more so we have to try and work hardly to locate it. Otherwise, this one and the other feed each other. This one and the other are dangerous to the same degree. I don't deny by saying that we the people, when we hear terrorism, we think about nationalistic feelings. When we speak about criminal law, and of course criminal organizations, it is more than individual criminal law, but it is less than terrorism. But it is just because we were raised this way, we were educated this way. It is time to change the disc. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Thank you, Michal and Ido, for the invitation. Thank you, Yad, for the presentation. Wonderful to see old friends also on the other side of the screen. So, as Mohammed articulated, and as you read in the article, we try to assert that there are significant similarities and a growing collaboration between terrorists and organized criminal groups in a way that justifies reconceptualization, or at the least reconsideration of the way in which we need to deal with both phenomena. Specifically, we try to show in the article operational collaboration. We try to demonstrate how both use similar tactics, and we also try to demonstrate how on the practical level and eventually the result of both organized crime and terrorism lead not only to violence and, of course, fear, but also to the erosion of the state apparatus and to undermining state sovereignty in a way that shows that those challenges, that there is room to consider an integrated approach to deal with those two challenges. I will try to expand a bit, and of course, then we will be happy to delve deeper into each part of the articles which you found of interest or you disagree with. So we'll start chronologically. The connection between crime and terrorism became evident first in the 1970s in Colombia, with the rise of groups like the ELN, Ejército Liberación Nacional, and the FARC, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias Colombianas. Those two groups presented a clear ideology and a desire to act as terror groups, but at the same time, they have taken together 40% of the territory of Colombia. They took over they began to collaborate with drug cartels and became significantly involved in drug trafficking, in kidnapping of persons for ransom, and in other criminal activities. During that time, the term which tried to articulate this phenomenon was narco-terrorism. Hence, we also Narcos on Netflix 10 years later. During the 1980s, as Mohammed mentioned, we saw this phenomenon starting to spread to other areas in the world, specifically Hezbollah and in the Middle East. And this was only the beginning of the phenomenon which we tried to describe in the article. During the 1990s and onwards, after the end of the Cold War and with the rise of globalization, we saw that there is a growing connection, which we refer to in the article as the crime-terror nexus, between organized criminal groups and between terrorists. This came about first because after the end of the Cold War, there was a decrease in state-sponsored terrorism, hence terrorist groups had to find new alternative ways to finance their operations. And in addition, globalization created new opportunities, new platforms of communication, easier access to travel, new ways to transfer funds, and etc. In a way that was actually perceived in the literature as the new economy of terror. And in addition, many viewed this period as the time in which the crime-terror nexus indeed began to consolidate on a more clear level. Moving on, the September 11 attacks were also a watershed moment, which led to the rise of international attention on the need to deal with terrorism and organized crime and the connection between the two. And we saw growing developments on the legal and practical level in the Security Council, in organizations like UNDOC and Interpol, and growing cooperation between states in a desire to deal with the threats that those phenomena create. Later, during COVID-19, the outbreak of the pandemic created a lot of vulnerabilities, given the need to enter into lockdown and to restrict travel. And in addition, during that period, criminal groups and terrorists alike used the vulnerability that emerged on the social level and on the individual level in order to instigate more fear and to recruit new members. So we have a new reality in which drug cartels from South America can sit on the same table with the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq and discuss together ways in which to transfer drugs either from South America through the Middle East or Southwest Africa to European markets or to other areas around the world. In addition, we also saw that ideological differences don't really come in the way of collaboration, as you can see by joint ventures between ultra-nationalist Turks and Kurd groups, or between Sunni, Shia, Druze, and Christians in Lebanon, which operate together in order to promote or sustain the drug market. Now, why is this happening? For many reasons. First and foremost, one can say that a criminal will deliver you whatever you want for the right price. And from the side of terrorists, it is more an opportunistic endeavor in the sense that terrorists both need criminal activities or the help of organized criminal groups to promote their operations, for example, falsification of documents. And in addition, at times, groups can change their nature in the sense that we saw terrorist groups which fall in love with the criminal activities And we also saw criminal groups like D Company in India, which later supplemented their activities with an ideological level and eventually found themselves transferring from a trafficking organization into a full-fledged terrorist group, which launched deadly campaigns in Bombay in the 1990s. In addition, there are also the matters of the conditions in reality. So poor governance, the lack of a rule of law, corruption, all of those considerations lead and invite to more collaboration between criminals and terrorists. And we gave the example in the article of Hezbollah in the 1990s, which was able to promote its deadly bombings in Buenos Aires, Argentina, due to the lack of sovereignty in the tri-border era between Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. Finally, penal correction facilities are also an important arena in which people are both radicalized and create relations, which later can develop into relations between terrorists and criminal groups. And two very known examples come from ISIS, from Daesh, Al-Dawla al-Islamiyya fil Iraq wal-Sham, where both the founder of the group, Abu Musa al-Zarqawi, and the first caliph of the group, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, were both radicalized in the same prison in Jordan. And in fact, the organization was born during those years in prison, where a small group of people created a sense of loyalty and belonging, which later was translated into the development of the group. Now, we recognize that there are, of course, differences and disincentives for the collaboration between terrorists and organized criminal groups. First, Mohammed mentioned the issue of covering the faces of plaintiffs. So generally speaking, organized criminal groups prefer to avoid public attention, scrutiny, and surveillance unless it is required, while terrorists operate in a different way. In addition, both fight or battle for a recruit from the same demographic, groups of people which live under a conception of social, political, or cultural marginalization. And of course, there is the matter that many believe that at the end of the day, crime is about making money, and terrorism is about a certain ideology or politics. While we recognize those differences, we believe that first, there are more examples of collaborations and symbiosis between the two. And in addition, the examples of organizations that change their nature also indicate that in our view, those differences are to be considered, but they are not preventing the ability to re-articulate the way that we look at those two phenomena. In terms of international developments, so indeed we deal with the Israeli legislation and some other comparative views, and we also refer to the joint criminal enterprise doctrine under international law. But in addition, we also refer to developments on the broader meta level, for example, collaboration between international organizations or between states and international organizations. We cover some of the important treaties that were adopted, for example, the United Nations Treaty on Organized Crime or the United Nations Treaty Against Corruptions, and we try to frame them into the story as well. And of course, we are showing the practice of states which on a daily basis cooperate together to deal with both terrorism and organized crime through mutual legal assistance, through extradition, and through other measures. So, in conclusion, to leave time for the Q&A, we have tried to show in the article that the two phenomena are closer to one another than apart. We believe that both terrorism and organized criminal groups lead to the erosion of state sovereignty and threaten the state apparatus in a way that invites an integrated approach. And finally, and this developed after the article was published, after we published the article, which was on a more broader level, we wrote a blog in Hebrew which tries to look more into the situation in Israel. And in fact, we are also working today with some parliament members and parliamentary committees which want to promote some legislation to deal with.
There is already. I mean, the legislature has already adopted our arguments, and there's a bill, a legislative proposal by Moshe Saada, and it's being discussed now at the, how's it called, the Committee for National Security in the Parliament. I was invited to talk about that. Why are we looking at me like that?
Good intentions can bring you to hell. That's in the Q&A.
That's a good point. So our hope is to try and find a way to translate this academic work into a practical impact on reality, and we are more than happy to discuss the dangers of this possible path. Thank you very much for your time and for listening, and we look forward to discussing the article with you.
Say you have strawberry and apple before.
Yeah.
And whiskey.
Make another shot.
So, the floor is open for questions. Let's go round.
Everything that comes to my mind might be naive, so it's good that I'm the first one. First, it was really interesting, and I generally accept. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I see why you would treat these two organizations as very similar. I'm worried if we talk about adopting that. We see now how easy it is to blame everyone as being a terrorist, especially someone who is not a citizen or behind some fence or outside the community. But not only, obviously.
Why treat everyone? I'm not sure I could.
The way I said that it's very easy to blame everyone or almost everyone as being a terrorist.
It's a slippery slope question.
But we see it in front of, very vividly now. We just had a talk in the break about how, just a Facebook post today can make you a terrorist very easily. So if you adopt the same method as, for criminal, what's going to happen? How do you think it could be avoided? And more empirical questions that maybe you thought about that. When I think about specifically in Israel, Jewish terrorist groups, we talk about Kach. Are they also connected to? Do you see the same similarities, or if it's part of the regime in a way, part of maybe not? Or I was just curious.
Let's take this off the table already now. We talk about organized crimes in general. In Israel, outside the state of Israel, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Christians, it doesn't really matter. The principle is the principle. I don't buy this distinction between Arab terrorists and Jewish terrorists, Arab criminal groups and Jewish criminal groups. By the way, if anyone here is really aspires to have peace in the Middle East, or the more so in Israel, then there is a great peaceful collaboration between Arab and Jewish organized crime, criminal groups. Amazingly. This is like prosperity.
Also on the academic level, a Muslim, a Druze, and a Jew enter a restaurant and come out with an article.
Who is the leader?
The one with the pin.
More like a state associated terrorist group and non-state or something like that.
What do you state associated?
Now,
I'm not naive in asking the question, but what do you mean? How do you find it, please? You need to prove it.
No, I was asking out of curiosity what you think about it. I don't have.
Same rules apply.
Maybe I'll just have a follow-up on this.
I will. Can I also?
Just on this last question, right. and then decide, because it's something that I was thinking about, which is to what extent you've treated terrorism as, in as something that involves fear in the general population, some threats, and relationship between this type of organization and crime, let's say, cooperation with drug cartels. So to what extent do you also adopt this vision of state terrorism or a state which is a terrorist organization? Think, for example, about the Syrian regime that benefited also from the drug cartels and also cooperated with similar groups. So to what extent is it part of your analysis, or do you think that there is a substantive difference in this?
Okay, so question. First, in relation to the slippery slope, I think that you gave an interesting example, which actually shows why there is a need for more regulation and more clarity and validity about what is the legal framework that applies to a situation. Because if you will take the example of a post in Facebook, so the way in which the state of Israel is enforcing the laws on the prohibition of incitement and etc. on the social networks is done by a department in the Ministry of Justice that is operating not based on legislation, without any clear definition of when it needs to exercise its authority, under which limitations, and how does it need to balance it with other considerations. So we are seeing indeed, for example, over-regulations of posts in Arabic than in other languages. And in fact, I think that this shows that if you had more regulation and more validity on the modus operandi of enforcement of the law, it can actually also prevent this slippery slope concern. So as always in life, you have two sides to a coin, and the question is, what is the policy that the government wants to promote? And in this regard, the policy of the lack of regulation allows the misuse of power. So that it was interesting that you raised this example, and I completely agree with Mohammed about the lack of distinction of the nature or type of terrorist groups. We refer to terrorist groups which are more focused on territorial questions, and we refer to terrorist groups which are more global or imperial in their nature, like Al-Qaeda, and we believe that the treatment should be the same. And in this regard, I think that first, in relation to Jewish terrorist groups and etc., I wrote within Nadiv a few years ago an op-ed on home demolitions, which is a specific the J-Post. So it is another example or a manifestation of a point in which you see a policy against terror being deployed only against one part of the population.
In a discriminatory manner.
Absolutely. So if you believe that this measure is necessary, then it should be applied to all instances of terrorism and all instances of organized crime. As per state terrorism, so this is a deep question that goes directly to the heart of the discussion or the problem of dealing with terrorism on the international stage, because this is exactly the point which divides between the West and the rest. The West is not willing to recognize state terrorism, as you know and you wrote yourself in the past. And I think that so long as we want to follow international rules and existing international tools, we need to put aside this agreement, because the international community did not resolve it, and we have to work with what we have. And that's why we try to extract, as is commonly done, those criteria or aspects of the definitions from many jurisdictions, and domestic and international, that can be located. And this controversial issue is indeed something we had to leave out. But if you want to delve deeper into this issue, we are thinking of doing a book project. Maybe we can write an article together on this question. I can learn a lot from you in the process.
So I want to jump on the point that Yuri raised.
What's your name?
Fadi.
Fadi.
So the question of the Facebook post is not about the regulation or the censorship or the complaints that are being submitted through the cyber unit, which is a unit within the Ministry of. I think he was mentioning the arrests, the utilization of the criminal procedure in order to pursue individuals who are considered based on various conceptions that the police had developed to have been inciting or sympathizing, and etc. All the kind of array of, and we see the slippery slope especially after October 7th. So that's a danger that I think is real, is happening. People have and are paying a lot of price in their freedoms and for things that prior did not used to elicit this kind of price. And on this, I want to build. So, I mean, I understand there's a lot of anecdotal evidence showing a relationship, symbiotic relationship, that you call it at some point, and mutually beneficial relations that could be seen in the interactions of organized criminals and terrorists. And now you're saying, which I think is more interesting, you are pushing for the adoption of this framework or understanding within Israeli law. Have you been able to establish factually this symbiotic relationship existing?
On the empirical evidence.
Empirical, yeah. So organized crime in Israel, Palestine, and terrorist groups actually working together or finding relationship. And finally, if you can address, because you don't do that in the paper, what particular tools you believe are useful? Because we've seen, I mean, Ben-Gvir has been promoting the usage of administrative detention. And how do you propose...
Especially to people who don't send each other.
I mean, it doesn't really matter because for Ben-Gvir, it's Arabs, right? I mean, even with the best of intentions, there are going to be people in key decision-making positions that will abuse that power. But even without the assumption of abuse, how do we not? So the war against terrorism has its own pathologies and the costs we're willing to pay in order to fight that war. But people are paying prices that shouldn't be paying them. How are we going to restrict that from happening if we use the same tools and broaden the use to other areas as well? And I'm sure somebody in the future is going to come and find some similarities in other domains and say that's what we need to do, right? So have you given any of this any thought?
Can I just follow up? I remember about that, because I come from a criminal law. I used to work as a criminal defense lawyer. I'm really acquainted in criminal law and I know how it works. I was wondering, okay, so you wrote this paper and I also looked at it and what did it add? What do you add to the legal set of tools that we didn't have previously? So we have these operational characteristics of the terror groups and the crime groups. But as from practical matter of legal doctrine, so you talked about JCE, but we have in the legal doctrines all kind of aiding, accomplice. So what else do we need? And not only what else do we need, what is this symbiotic connection that you're talking about? What does it entails. Additionally, from, let's say, if we look at the terrorist groups by itself and the crime group by itself, and each has its own characteristics, and now you're looking at them together, what does it add that we didn't have before?
I'm a bit concerned
About the whole project?
No. I'm concerned because there's too much highlight on Ben-Gvir. When you articulate a formula, a legal formula, you articulate it regardless the name of this or that minister be as awful or as good. Today it's Ben-Gvir, tomorrow it's Moshe, after that that's Muhammad, after that that's Miriam. You need the articulation of the legislation as proper as possible, regardless the particular identity of the person now in politics. The other level of discussion will be, of course, the application of the law, and that, of course, related to the identity of the government in different times, in different circumstances, in different eras, be the left, be the right, be the center, be Arabs, Jews, and so on and so forth. So my fear concerning, or your fear, or our fear concerning the application of the law should be a fear of principle, regardless the main behavior. Now, the second reservation that I would like to make, let's understand what exists nowadays on the table. The concept of criminal organizations as being covered by a separate set of laws already exists, not only in Israel, but in many democratic countries in the world. They are not just individual criminals, they are not just joint criminals. It is not the classic conservative analysis of accomplices. I don't want to tell you, and you should know better than I, that the whole theories about accomplices has failed. It is more about interpretation, but towards the end of the day, it has been a result or a story of failure. The difference between joint criminal activity and criminal organizations is the word organizations. Historically speaking, the development of accomplices was about Muhammad and Tal joining each other. They were not talking about criminal corporations. I mean, I don't know to what extent, to what degree you have been diving into this world of criminal organizations. This is a corporation with all that term holds on its shoulder. You have a leader. It's a firm. It's a firm. And they know how to work, and they have consultants in accountants, in legal questions, etc. Now, in Israel, there are around 9 or 10, depends to what degree we agree on the details. Terrorist groups. Criminal organizations. Criminal organizations.
That's the question.
They are already defined as criminal organizations, and they are already being covered under a special set of rules, not the criminal one. What we are suggesting is that the existing rules nowadays, as good as they are not sufficient, and we ask to borrow some other tools from the world of terrorism and denote them as terrorists. And if this is a slippery slope doctrine, I welcome this doctrine particular to them. And if there will be discrimination over using the term terrorism towards criminal groups as such, organization as such, so it be. These people on their life, all they do is about causing fear and instability among the society. You go to Netanya, you fear their own national, local criminal organization. You go to Jat, to Bakr Garbiya, to Jaljuya, to Kalansawa, to Tia. We know their names. They're already there. So we have to be as harsh as possible towards them. And when I say harsh as possible, you have to prove as the state, first of all, that the person you are targeting is part of this criminal organization. It's a burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not just, I think he is part of this organization. It's not based on families. The problem is that when it comes to the Arab society, we used to speak of criminal families. It used to be the case. It is not the case. I don't want to get in trouble now, but they don't call themselves families. They are not anymore a story of hegemony. All of them for relatives, cousins, and brothers. It's a collection of professionals from different places, by the way, with stars from different cities, including Jews. So as you would see in Sakhnin soccer game, you have Jewish players, and Maccabi Haifa, you have Arab players. It exists already in the world of criminal organizations.
Thank you, Mohammed. To supplement, first have a great pushback, excellent pushback questions. But I think that what you're describing on the level of arrests, rather than monitoring of content, I think that this is more a paradigm shift than a slippery slope. I think that after October 7, we saw a complete paradigm shift on the balance between security and human rights. So we are seeing it on the level of arrests for expression, for example, And we're seeing it also in other fields. We're seeing the growing use of technological surveillance. We're seeing the growing use of biometric data. We're seeing the desire to introduce a law on spywares and etc. So to me, it feels more like a paradigm shift, a moment in which the whole structure of what is changing it before our eyes rather than simply a slippery slope. It's deeper than that, in my view. Now,
more.
I agree.
You're arguing for fun.
Yeah.
Sorry?
You're arguing for fun.
I agree that this is a concern, absolutely. But at the same time, I believe that regulation, that introducing regulation, concretizing the theoretical discussion that we suggest, I think that during this process of concretization and Nadiv, you said in many instances in the parliament and impacted legislation, so we are aware of that once the legislation enters the pipe, it goes out completely different at the end. And the reason that it goes out completely different at the end is because of civil society, experts, and etc., which allow to insert better safeguards, better checks and balances within the legislation. So I agree with you, but I still maintain the general line of thought that we introduce. As for anecdotal data, so first on the international level and comparative level, we rely on empirical data. We rely on the work of excellent scholars like Alex P. Schmidt, and we also rely on the work of international organizations, the Committee Against Terrorism, the Security Council, and etc. So there is empirical data that we rely on the international and comparative level, but you are correct. We are lacking empirical question in relation to Israel, and there is a question to be asked. So we know that there are collaborations, for example, in the field of trafficking of weapons or smuggling of weapons. But at the same time, you need to have something more concrete, methodological in this field, and our hope is that with a joint work with the parliament, we can develop and delve deeper and evaluate empirically the situation within Israel, and then tailor a suit which considers whatever findings this empirical work will do. So hopefully we will be able to do it in collaboration with, and if not, we will do it on our own, or maybe we'll invite you to join us. It seems like you could help us in this regard. As for specific tools, then it is another very interesting question, and I think that we can discuss each tool is a world and beyond. So administrative detention or spywares, each one raises different a multitude of considerations and questions. So I will give one example of a yes for me, which is spywares. I believe that spywares should be regulated and introduced against organized criminal groups and against terrorists. And I even sat with the head of the Committee for National Security, Domestic Security, and we discussed the types of uses for spywares, and in fact the political issue came up. They really wanted to promote the use of spywares also for political reasons, which is a very bad idea, absolutely. But at the same time, I believe that when it comes to organized crime and terrorism, the level of impact on society, the level of impact it has on our lives, on the quality of our lives, on our social fabric, it justifies some extreme means. So for me, spywares can be a tool under certain limitations that can be helpful in both arenas. But other tools, for example, administrative detention, I'm less convinced that it is appropriate, because administrative detention at the end of the day doesn't deal with the problem. It just puts it aside rather than facing it head on.
Avoiding the problem.
Exactly. So it depends on the specific thing. And here again, if you want, you can delve deeper over a cup of coffee on the specific. Always. I'm getting to it. Benny. Okay. So you're asking an important question, which the editor of the journal should have asked us before publishing it as a lead article. But thankfully, we've passed that test. I'm joking, of course. I think up the atmosphere. So I will answer you on two levels, okay? On the academic level, on the practical level. So on the academic level, this article decided to focus on the conceptual level. So we understood there is a need to convince on the conceptual level about the similarities and the reason to think of both phenomena as something which requires an integrated approach. So the article focuses on that. and does not translate this conceptual premise into concrete steps. And we felt that there was more than enough discussion on the theoretical, doctrinal, and etc. Levels that justifies focusing only on the conceptual level. And we understood that this is maybe the beginning of a process, rather its end. At the same time, we also hoped, and as of this moment, it is indeed happening, we hope to have a practical impact on reality. I personally believe that academic work has the best value when it meets reality. So with all due respect to the grade of journal in which you publish, in my view, if your article is translated into reality and makes an impact on reality, for me it is much more important, and for me, I can retire after such an achievement rather than publishing in a certain...
Your retirement days come.
Too soon. So for us, it was conceptual on the academic level, and also lurking or hinting into the possibility to promote practical steps. And finally, we also believe, and Mohammed mentioned it, that there is room for also more standardization and harmonization in dealing with both phenomena. And here you have a disparity. You actually have more regulation that deals with organized crime and less regulation that deals with terrorism. So you have more means that are deployed against terrorism, but usually they are extra legal. They are not regulated under the law. So in our view, it is a good idea on the side of terrorism to introduce more legislation, more legal regulation that will help to balance between the different considerations. And from the side of organized crime, it will be better to have new tools to deal with this phenomenon. So I accept the challenge which you present before us, and I think that future work that we will do will answer it. And I hope that for now, you will be satisfied with this.
Another question from there, Eli?
Yes, thank you. Welcome, Tal and Mohammed. I'm really sorry that I cannot be with you physically, but I was terrorized by doctors who ordered me to stay at home. Very provocative and interesting paper, and I want to ask you two questions. One is, what is missing in your analysis? You talk about terrorism as a political phenomenon, terrorism as a criminal phenomenon. The origin of terror is actually state terrorism, 18th century France, the regime of terror. And I think your analysis is not full without also addressing state terrorism. If the state inserts fears on citizens by using all kinds of legal or illegal means to silence people, to deter them from the public space, etc., we should also address this phenomena as part of terrorism. And the question how you relate to that. The other question is, what is not terrorism? You know, after 7th of October, everything is related to terrorism. Maybe this is a question that should be directed to your third partner in the article. But many things, you know, that including, you know, expressions, demonstrations, are associated immediately with terrorism. And at least according to your test of inserting fear among the population, these are not terrorist attack or terrorist activities. So your analysis is actually interesting in both respects. What should we include under the roof of terrorism and what we should not include under the roof of terrorism? And I think this is also a missing link in the presentation. So I will be happy to hear your reaction to these two remarks.
Just before answering, I follow up to the first question because it relates to what I asked before. And I think that the answer was, this is how it's perceived under current international law, something along these lines. But here I think about two things. First is that you suggest something new, right? Criminal organizations are not perceived as terrorism, so relying on existing law. So this is a normative discussion. So you need to have some kind of normative argument about the potential difference between states and non-state actors in this regard. And the second that actually relates to the second question of Eli is about what is not terrorism. It's also about your definition, who defines the actors. And here I think it's crucial because in my field or my main field of international law, which is the laws of armed conflict, we don't have the notion of terrorist organization, and it's not by chance. We do have the act of terrorizing the civilian population, but the organizations are called organized armed groups. So we accept the possibility that there are at least potentially some organized armed groups that are not terror organizations. And here I wonder, what do you demand in order to perceive an organized criminal organization as something that is similar? Because we can imagine, just like organized armed groups, that we can have an organized criminal organization that does not act focusing on fear among the civilian population. Let's imagine a firm of criminals, and they only target other criminals and do some really sophisticated, let's say, cyber crime or whatever, and they have the organization, the accountants, the legal facilities and everything. They will not fall under your definition of this terrorist criminal organization. So how you define it? And I think that in many ways it's different than how the law works here, because how do we define terror organizations in Israel? The Ministry of Defense says this is a terror organization, right? It doesn't,
or the security council,
or something, right? So we don't have a substantive definition. We just say, Hamas is a terror organization. Well, apparently it falls under our substantive definition, but it's not necessary that this will be the case. And how do we determine that something is an organized criminal enterprise? Again, whether it's just a determination of some minister, or we must follow your normative evaluation in order to.
Well, thank you both for these questions. Actually, we already, when we wrote this paper, we were aware of the fact that it's not comprehensive. Not it is impossible to have a comprehensive article with all related questions, but one of the failures of this article is that we did not state explicitly our desire to write several papers on this topic. Maybe we should have clarified that in the introduction, explaining that we have a conceptual article here, and we point out the normative and the consequential questions, and say that in the future we'll be writing about that. That's one thing. Second thing is that this article did not come to the world in a vacuum. The questions and the dilemmas concerning terrorism and what constitutes terrorism already exist. We did not create them. So it's not this article that now has not discussed what terrorism means and who decide what terrorism means. And even it's not October 7th. Prior to that, at the age of September 11, these questions of what terrorism means started to be striking. And of course, after the establishment of the legislation of the Patriotic Act in the United States and the same statute in Israel, I call it all the time the Patriotic Act, but it's called the law on counterterrorism legislation. So these are valid questions, whether we have addressed them or we have not addressed them. And the third point here is that one of the failures of the 2003 legislation on organized criminalization in Israel and organized crimes in Israel is that they created status crimes, but no one told us who is entitled, who is authorized to decide what is an organized crime. So basically it was left to the judiciary, and it's not clear at which phase of the criminal trial. In the new legislation to come out, when we received the first proposal, the first draft of I don't know if it's the first, but the first for us One, it was, and this is about intentions, and you're right about that, and we suspect things, we are not naive as well. It was up for the Minister for National Security. And I just start reading the proposal, and immediately I vetoed that. I said, before we continue with our comments, if this is going to be the case, then we have nothing to talk about. And we send it back, and we asked that it should be subject to the authority of the court, at least at the level of district judge, all the more so, of course, Supreme Court justice. Now, so this is a question of evidence, because when you ask the court to declare a group, any group, an organized criminal group, then you have to prove enough evidence to the court that they have the features of organized criminalization, including the features on which Tal elaborated previously. This is not an easy task. This is not an easy task at all. I mean, it is easy to talk about already existing criminal groups in Israel. We know them by their names. Abutbul, what else? Dumrani and Abul Taib, etc., etc. So that's easy to talk about the current ones, and maybe to that extent we are failing to fulfill faithfully what we aspire to do, because we discuss already existing criminal organizations, whereas you're fully true about that there might come in the future criminal organizations that have different features, what we do by then. So this is a point to be taken, and I agree with that. As for state terrorism, Eli, I definitely agree with you, first of all, about the fact that you mentioned that terrorism started by discussing state terrorism. But, you know, we're talking, the paper is taken here within the context of criminal law. When we speak about a state as a state of terror, I doubt if the solution for a state of terror is national or internal law. I mean, the way to cope with a state of terror as the way to cope against a tyranny in the first place is you don't go to the High Court of Justice, submit petition and say, well, we have to declare the state. You have to have the political tools that you might have, not only in election day, but also sometimes in civil and public activity in order to get rid of this regime. Or sometimes, you know, approach the international community. So as valid as this question is, and it is valid, and I completely agree with you, and maybe you're right about that we should have addressed this in the first place, I doubt if this is a normative question to be dealt with within the realm of criminal law.
So just to add, in relation to the first question by Lee and Yali later on, I think that the main issue here, or the main problem, is not that we rely on international law as it is, the lex lata, and we're not trying to supplement it. The issue with state terrorism goes to one of the main bugs in the system of international law. International law is a system which is tailored for states, and it is a system which promotes the interest of states. And in this regard, it doesn't matter if we talk about terrorism or if we talk about international humanitarian law, the state centrism of international law impacts the ability to harness international law as a tool to limit the ability of states to operate. And we can even go back to and this also relates to the second issue which you mentioned. Can there be a militia which is not a terror group? So I think that first, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. Of course, that in the eyes of Turkey and Syria, PKK is a terrorist group. And of course, that in the eyes of Colombia, the FARC, ELN, and the M19 were terrorist groups. But in the eyes of others, there may be militia forces that are securing their territories and etc. But there is a tension. There is a tension between states, which one of the main manifestations of sovereignty, at least according to Max Weber, is the monopoly on the use of force. And militias are threatening this monopoly. Exactly, they threaten the state apparatus in this regard. And even if we look at IHL specifically, then we can look at the story of the Declaration of Brussels. So as Doreen Lustig and Eyal Ben-Benisti articulated very well, in 1871, during the Franco-Prussian War, the German forces entered France, and France did what it does best, which is to surrender. But a very proud group of local residents in Paris, the Paris Commune, decided to fight back. And later on, the Declaration of Brussels from 1874 actually tried to take back the monopoly on the use of force from rogue militia like the Paris Commune, or from pirates, which developed into their own individual entities, and to take it back to the states. So in my view, it is a bug in the system. It is not a feature or a desire to simply rely on the tools that we have. It is something fundamental, and we are unable to change it, especially not with an academic article. As for the issues of social unrest, protest, and etc., and what is defined as terrorism, so I accept the comment. Zaid was the most suited person to answer this question, but I think that maybe because Zaid is the most suited person to answer the question, he's not here. And I think you will understand.
The Minister of Justice have thought of that.
I was wondering because
John first. John?
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. Yeah, and I like it very much. And now I just have a question about the problem of the state-aided hackers. And I want to know your opinion from the perspective of practice. And do you think the state-aided hackers are kind of extension of the organized crime or the terrorism, or do you think it's a kind of amplifies the technology, the use of technology and the resources. The hackers who are financed and supported by the state. Yeah.
So, just to make sure we understood, you are asking about the nature of the relation. What do we identify as the nature of the relation? Is it cooperation or symbiosis or consolidation and etc.?
Yeah, the hackers, they're financed and they're supported by the state for the purpose of propaganda, for the purpose of geopolitical, something like that. Or they disrupt the critical infrastructure. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Mohammed,
I have to be a father as well, and I have to pick up my daughter from school.
I can stay for an extra 10 minutes, or we can.
I leave him alone here.
We will take care of him.
So
if you make me, my sincere apologies, but I have to leave, and I leave you the best.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me here.
Bye-bye.
So
I will drink the whiskey, so guarantee.
You have many, like, if you talk about terrorist organizations, it's part of the toolkits that are used also different in essence, like the negotiation. Some organizations start as a terrorist group and then have been acknowledged as legitimate. We are witnessing now negotiations that were reported to have
Al-Julani in Syria.
Money transfer to the Hamas, etc. So you think that such tools should be also used against
rehabilitated groups.
Yeah. Okay. No, against criminal groups. Like, would you negotiate with them? Would you do the same thing if you take the comparison one step forward? Would you accept them as legitimate in some sense someday?
So this is an important question, the question of legitimacy. And indeed, we are seeing an evolution in the life of terror groups. So we can look at, for example, at the PLO, and we can look at Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and we are seeing it all around the world, and by the way, also in Colombia. The current president of Colombia was the leader of the entry to the Supreme Court. So today, the guardian of the Supreme Court was the leader of the military operation to destroy the archives of the Supreme Court in the 1980s. So on the one hand, regarding a group as terrorist, and one manifestation of regarding a group as terrorist is to decide not to negotiate with it. But it is one manifestation of a broader issue, which is the legitimization of the group and of the operation of the group. And when a group moves from an illegitimate entity into a legitimate political entity, it transcends, it goes through a process of normalization. So on the one hand, we want to promote normalization. You want to promote more actors to join the community of actors which are treated in society as legitimate and as ones which you can trust and cooperate with. But on the other hand, you can see misuse. You can see misuse of this process, for example, of entities which enjoy their new role, a new hat as a political actor, while continuing to breach the law and promote interests which are anti-societal. So it is a dilemma, and I think that here it is more a matter of policy than law. It is a matter of which moral view you want to consider the situation with. And in Israel, I think that it will be hard to promote a stance which advocates for normalization, because the current part of the paradigm shift we are going through on the level of our society as Israelis. I think it is also translated to growing suspicion to the PLO and to a growing advocacy against the legitimacy of the normalization of the PLO. So at least in Israel, I'm skeptic that
but I was wondering, do you want to normalize criminal groups to find a path for them?
So they're doing it on their own. Many criminals reach a certain critical mass of fortune and then become constructors, real estate dealers, and etc. So this is something that is happening on the practical economic level rather than on the level of society, because organized groups never lived under the shadow of being an illegitimized entity altogether that we are not even willing to deal with, to talk with. But again, very interesting line of thought, and I hope that I gave you some response. And as for Jan, so you raised two issues. One is the harnessing of technology to promote the goals of terrorism and organized crime, and the second, it was a sub-question about the nature of the relation between terrorists and organized criminal groups. So the article answers the issue of the nature of the relation, and we give examples of collaboration, we give examples of convergence, and we give examples of groups which completely change their nature. And we also try to deal very mildly with the issue of technology, but this is a side issue, the misuse of technology in order to infiltrate vulnerabilities on the level of our societies. So the vulnerability can be on an economic level, it can be on the level of safeguarding private data. It can be on the level of impacting society, for example, influence operations. So terror groups today, and also states which support terrorist groups, find cyberspace as a very convenient tool to promote influence operations. So today, Iran can try and infiltrate Israeli society and try to come in the way of us maintaining some certain of hegemony, solidarity, and a sense of belonging just through the social networks, by activating some fake profiles, some Telegram channels, and by some more advanced attempts. For example, China has a whole strategy on the way to promote, since 2012, they have a whole strategy on influence operations, and they say it openly. They don't even view it as something which is negative. So cyberspace is a world and beyond. to discuss the world of cyber attacks, the world of phishing, the world of cyber influence operations, and etc. So it's another very good and important question, which I can only answer on a bird's eye view in this format. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any more questions? So maybe just one last thing.
Save the best for last.
Well, it's just a kind of further complication of a previous point. I think that your answer reveals like two theoretical ways to view it. When you suggest that states have like the view of the problem with non-state armed groups is not their terrorist behavior, but their competition over the monopoly, over the use of power. And I think that you can use a similar paradigm when you think about organized armed groups. It's not just a criminal, it's an organized armed group, but is also a threat over the monopoly of power. And it's very different in how you describe it. It might solve some of the challenges, but it also leads to a different direction. I think that you need to think about it. In what direction are you going? And the second thing here, I think, is when you think about why, and it's part of what, it's behind what you said, like an alternative explanation of why we don't think about state terrorism. It's because states are reluctant to be associated with the delegitimization that is associated with terrorism. And it goes back, I think, to the question of Uri and what Fadi said and what was here around the room the whole time, is that there are serious concerns with the designation of organized criminal organization as terror organization, the broad impact on society and so on. And I think that you have two normative arguments here. One is we need to use strong tools to deal with these organized criminal entities. And I think that this is something that is important. And it also cries, right, look, we have a serious problem here. Let's face it, and I think that it's a valid point, and I do think that in the Israeli society, as an example, we don't care as much as we need about this horrible reality of organized criminal groups. But the other thing is also a symbolic call to designate them as terrorists. And I think that you should maybe think about it a bit more following these discussions. And I think that it's probably, it's perfectly fine to say we thought about it a lot. We still stand behind our thing that we need to have this symbolic value as well as the tools. But I think that you can also have potentially like an answer at the end that says we want to use the tools but not designate them as due to the concerns or something. But you do have to deal with the concern that you hear here a bit more, I think, because it reveals, I think, the potential impact that we'll have for such legislation among the society.
So, thank you. Quick follow-up. I think that maybe in the end of the discussion, we also need to zoom out from the question of criminalization, which is the field that you are dealing with, to more broader social question of what are the alternative costs and what could be other means to approach the problem. So we are all agreeing that we have a harsh problem, a bleeding problem. And all of the examples that you brought in the article, all of them, I think, the vast majority, but I think all of them are in the context of the undeveloped world in which organized crime and terror could flourish. Now, I can bring you an example from the Israeli context about a trade-off that the former government dealt with when trying to deal with this bleeding problem. One path, advocated by Gideon Saar, the more militant fraction of this government, was, okay, let's just terrorize everything. Let's criminalize, not only criminalize, but let's call them the policy move that has a lot of costs, a lot of social costs, trust costs, legitimation costs, and also monetary costs. once you are going to that path, you are deciding to invest your shekel, to invest your money in enforcement and in, I would have say, the most harsh enforcement mechanism that you can find. The other fraction of the government went and promoted government decision 922. You know what 922 is, right?
Investment.
What?
Investment?
Yeah, investment. So they say, okay, we have this, 10 million shekels that we can do. We can do it via enforcement and terrorizing. We can do it by development and investment. So I think that the bigger picture, and also in the Israeli context, is at least in the minimum, if we are agreeing to your justification, it has to be with other institutional and governmental investment. And that, for me, will signal that the government that promotes your suggestions is sincere in its willingness to really approach the problem and not just to, like Ben-Gvir and others, to terrorize stuff.
Let's call it a semi-follow-up. It's borderline.
It's a borderline.
But I wanted to be last. It was a legitimate question, but it was a borderline question. And Tal, you have 3 minutes, so whatever.
Why not? I agree, Nadir. And actually, we refer in the article also to the need for rehabilitation alongside enforcement, so we refer to it, and in addition, we also refer to the costs of the war on terror in the sense of human rights, and we try to promote the stance that human rights and security are intertwined, codependent, and the one bolsters the other, but at the same time, it is completely true. Means to fight terrorism impacted liberties, civil liberties, and they impacted the right to due process, and etc. And it is something that must be dealt with. And I agree with you. An integrated approach is not only integrated in the sense of perceiving terrorists as organized criminals and vice versa. It is also integrated in the sense of enforcement alongside rehabilitation. So that's a very important point. And Yali, the fact that I answer shortly does not mean that I cancel or not thinking about a question. It's the format that we are in. I have 3 minutes to answer. But I absolutely agree with you. I constantly think about those issues. When I write an article, Aaron Magad said that a monologue writing is a monologue that seeks to become a dialogue. So for me, it's about that. For me, when I write, I want to hear objections. I want to hear new perceptions. I want to continue thinking about it. And I appreciate the pushbacks and all of the considerations. And on the level of the essence of what you mentioned. So in my view, state terrorism is not only Assad interrogating in human tactics. For me, the civil forfeiture practice in the United States, which completely wraps randomly people on the street in order to sustain police operations, it is also state terrorism. But once again, states are the main players, which not only under international law, also under domestic law, they are the authority. The state apparatus is the authority, and the authority can misuse its power. And there is a limit. Not every misuse of power can and should be considered as terrorism. So you are raising an important question, and I will take your advice and continue thinking about it. So I will not give you a definite answer about it. And thank you very much, everyone, for the very